We're going to continue our walk north on Bathurst Street, and both symbolically and geographically. And we noticed already last week that the community has gotten much more complex. What by 1933 was a community of great division, of different intra-ethnic organizations that competed, of a large mass of what we like to call downtown Jews who really did not want to acculturate or assimilate, a small number of uptown Jews who were desperately trying to consolidate the community because as the Depression worsened and as communal needs burgeoned and increased even further, as you recall, there had to be some kind of organization and fundraising. And that process was sped up by the war. And so by 1946, we already have the United Jewish Welfare Fund. We have an organization that's the direct predecessor of the UJA. And we have the Zionists, whose campaign had been apart from the welfare funds for ideological reasons, is now beginning to think about getting together with the communal campaign. In 1948, with the birth of the State of Israel, that actually comes to fruition. And as well, with the war over, suburbanization begins to pick up. Some Jews, as you can tell from the presence of Holy Blossom immediately to our north by 1937, had already come up this way, now that there were bridges and the road was paved. And from 1946 on, there's a huge amount of pent-up economic activity in Ontario that has a tremendous demographic effect on the Jewish community. So today we're going to continue our geographical and somewhat chronological, and I suspect today somewhat ideological analysis of what's going on in our community. And if at the end of this you feel tired from the walk, you can always replay it. If you have a lot of questions, we can start answering them. I actually hope, as I do with my students all the time, and you are among my students, that when I'm done, you have a lot of questions and some ideas as to what the answers may be. So I alluded to that. Take a moment and read it over. I just want to reiterate that had there not been a war, fundraising and centralization would have taken a decade longer. The government, basically, the Canadian federal government, wanted each ethnic community to have a central fundraising agency so that most ethnic fundraising went into war bonds. And all ethnic organizations were permitted one fundraising campaign a year. And that's why the UJWF was pushed to supremacy, not only through its own excellent efforts that I spoke about at length last week, but the efforts of the government to say, we want most money to go to the war effort, and when Jews or Greeks or Japanese fundraise once a year, please. The birth of Israel, of course, was a cataclysmic event in fundraising, and so these things speak for themselves. As I spoke about last time, and this is what I discovered in my research, all these changes in the community are inspired by this first cohort of university graduates. They're all professionals. In an age where professionalism is lauded and loved, social workers become the Jewish civil service. And this comes just in time, as I'm still reminding you, but this is an idea that doesn't stop throughout our period, that we needed, the community needed, to rationalize fundraising because the wealthy of the community, who regularly give 75 to 80% of the funds in the campaign, they want one-stop campaigning. They want 34 knocks at their door. They want one. I want to also remind you here and begin to move forward with this chart. So I'm going to actually do something I don't usually do. I'm going to read out loud and take you through it. The in-group, as we saw, were the uptowners of Holy Blossom and later on Goel Tzedek and McCall. Most of them are businessmen and professionals for a simple reason. If you want to get involved in Jewish communal work, you need free time. Salaried workers don't have much. Professionals and businessmen had time to run off to a lunch meeting. They also had a social contact network. Back then it was called Rolodex. Now it's called LinkedIn, but it works the same way. They were the people who could inspire others to give, and they were the ones who had time to have meetings. The Zionists after 1948, as I said, get involved with this as well. And generally, not completely, but generally most of the uptowners arrived before 1914 or are very, very young when they arrive. The out-group, and I don't mean in a negative way, but the group that is not as comfortable with all this professionalism are the Landsmannschaften, the small groups like the Drilser, the Ivansker, all these people came over from Europe and their first impulse was A, to find work, and B, to find more people of their Landsmann, more people who lived in their neighborhood in Poland. And smaller shuls on the same model. The other key out group, and we're going to talk a lot about this, are the unionized workers and non-unionized workers. They are completely outside at this early time the structured community. They have their own community, and they're very conscious of that, and they will contribute a tremendous amount to the community in a very different way that we're going to look at carefully tonight. The communists were in and out. They were out for most of the time. When Stalin suddenly switched sides after Russia was attacked, they were in again for a while because they had to be. And then after the war, especially with the Guzenko affair, they were out again. Most of the out group were later immigrants called the Grina. And later on we have the Holocaust survivors who between 1948 and the Eichmann trial, as my friend Frank Bialystok has pointed out in his excellent book, basically the community was really uninterested in hearing what survivors had to say. More on that later in spades. Well, back to sociology. I put it this way in my first lecture. How did some people get from the ward to Forest Hill in 40 years? Rabbi Freeman Cole said, how did Jews become white? Either way, it's the same question. And I want to make that our theme tonight because it's a very interesting question. When did we become mainstream? And is that a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing? What does it mean for our future? So I want you to look at the questions and start to run them through your head. You probably have already around your dining room table. Run them through your head for a moment now. Number 3 and 4. 3 we'll talk about, and 4 will be your thinking work when you leave. I will provide you and myself in a way with some thoughts about the price of acceptance and the different price tags. But we'll talk about 1 and 2 right now. My friend Morton Weinfeld up at McGill had a great title for his book about Canadian Jewish sociology. He called it like anyone else, but everyone else it should be, but different. That's what it means to become white. We Jews are like, I don't know, like you ask people, I don't know, I'm like everyone else, but I'm Jewish. What does that mean? Well, that's why we're here tonight. So there's this sense of, yes, we are the same, but somehow, in some manner that we can talk about, we're not quite the same, and you know what? We're happy about that. I'm going to suggest two roads to whiteness. You don't know what I mean yet, so I'm going to expand. Look at the left side. The left side is obviously one of these iconic Jewish history headlines that I get to scream at my students if they don't know. Might even be that I might even want them to memorize the date, which is the 14th of May, 1948. It's like almost like everyone knew where they were back then, like Kennedy's assassination, or like 9/11. On the other side, we see something else. I'm going to show you that there's two roads to whiteness in the Jewish community. One that I suggest on the left is more familiar to most of us. One that on the right, that when I start to talk about it, you'll go, oh yeah, I get it. Take a moment, please. I'm going to play sociologist and coin a term. That's what I mean by internal whitening. Let me explain as a historian, because I like sociology, but it doesn't stand up without history. If we look at the history of Zionism in Toronto, we see this tremendous burst of euphoria in 1948, a justified euphoria, the first Jewish state in almost 2 millennia, an almost unprecedented historical event, a watershed in world history. Rarely has a people denied statehood ever come back to recreate it. Rarely, if ever, have a people denied statehood ever in the midst of its birth and surrounded by hostile enemies offered an olive branch at the moment of its birth. And therefore, for diaspora Jews, 1948 to 1979 was a golden age. Israel could do no wrong. In fact, in 1967, as Heschroper wrote so well in The Defining Decade, Jews in the diaspora, thinking that it was all over for the state of Israel, actually felt such a kinship with the state of Israel that not only did they contribute millions of dollars, but many, many of them actually went to Israel to try to help just before or just after the Six-Day War. And many of us in this room will remember sitting by our TVs actually wondering if this was going to be a second Holocaust. And some of us may remember the famous cartoon in the Washington Post of LBJ, U.S. President, coming into the room of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of whom, like Moshe Dayan, and saying, what do we do in Vietnam? So this was a golden age of Zionism, of belief in Toronto that everything Israel did was great. And here in Beth Tzedec, where so many Israeli presidents came to speak, this certainly exemplified it. However, with the events of Sabra Shatila, the First Lebanon War, suddenly the diaspora began to question Israel. And what's fascinating is not that there were questions asked only, but that if you read the Canadian Jewish news over those years, that so many letter writers felt horrified that Jews would question the Jewish state. Now, if I think about that sociologically and I divorce myself emotionally from that, what we're seeing here is almost an ethnic immaturity. We've come so far, we should be comfortable in our skins, and we can talk about Israel. It's our homeland, but most of us are not running there. But yet, we still feel squeamish. We don't want open criticism. It's almost like the whispers I used to hear from my parents in the old days, shh, be quiet. The Goyim will think bad things of us. It doesn't look nice. Pasnish. Jews don't do such things. And so whether it's a healthy debate is a useful thing. And gradually a debate developed in the community over whether Israel's actions could be discussed in the media and in the community. Somewhere along the line, as we'll see, supporting Israel was skewed a little bit after this to become inexorably linked with Jewish identity in a very interesting manner. And the last matter about Zionism being a unifier, hold on for a moment, we're getting there fast. Because the Shoah becomes the second factor of North American and certainly Toronto Jewish identity. When I show you the population statistics in a moment, you'll see that Toronto had a huge number of Shoah survivors who came. We estimate, Frank and I, somewhere in 18 to 23,000 came in a population of 130,000 or less. They made up a significant portion of the community, and they had a tremendous impact. Now, the survivors of the Shoah endured two periods. The first period are the years of silence. It lasted to the Eichmann trial. And Frank and I have so many examples of this. Frank tells one story, which you may have heard, where people brought in their survivor family, and the family began to tell their story to their cousin. And their cousin, after about 20 minutes, put up her hand and said, please, things weren't so good here either. We couldn't buy nylons, and gas was rationed. I remember my father, Olav Shalom, was raised in 1978, when we were well into the Holocaust Education Week agenda, and they had to show multi-part series, the book Holocaust, on TV. And I'm watching the show, and there's this, what I remember to be a horrific scene of refugees on the road in Poland, and the Nazi Stuka dive bombers shooting refugees on the road and just massacring people as they walked, even though they were obviously civilians. And I said to my father, oh my God, and he looks at me and he says, Hollywood. He never talked about the war. I looked at him and said, what do you mean? He said to me, I saw the live action, and this is Hollywood. So these people, and I saw my father speak to his friends in Yiddish and never speak to anyone else about anything. These people felt for a long time that no one was listening to them. But then suddenly, the Eichmann trial opened the sluice gates of Jewish communal hearing. I remember I was interviewing a very prominent Toronto figure about the orphans. And as you know, we had a large orphan movement here, sponsored by the Congress. And the vast majority of parents who stepped forward to be foster parents wanted to have a child between 3 and 7. And if you read their letters saying, why are there no children between 3 and 7? I don't want a 16-year-old. I don't want a 17-year-old. They're too much trouble. Where are all the little children? And I remember interviewing a very prominent community member who told me, I literally went down to Kensington Market after I came back from Europe and said to people, where do you think the children are? And he brought with him a picture of the smokestacks at Auschwitz. So there was a huge disconnect. And over the Eichmann trial began, I wouldn't call it a healing process, but I would call it at least a better listening process. And the community became far more aware of the Holocaust. So much so that after a while, the Holocaust, along with Israel, became the two pillars of Toronto Jewish identity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the decision was made to pass this legacy on in the educationally brilliant idea of the March of the Living, which is now in its 25th year. Now, the March of the Living is a brilliant conflation of Zionism and the Shoah. The participants, mostly in grade 11, and there's all kinds of different marches now, and That's very important to understand. But the original march, I'm talking about the original iteration of the march, involved Jewish high school students, mostly in grade 11, who would travel to Poland and walk down the tracks in Auschwitz on Yom HaShoah, and for a week later be in Eretz Yisrael on Yom HaAtzmaut. Now, there's a tremendous emotional roller coaster there. The Megillah puts it well, miyagon l'simcha u'me'ever le'yom tov, from the depths of tragedy to joy, from mourning to a day of gladness. And these young men and women were transported on that, and they were told, never forget. Now, over the years, the march was broadened to include non-Jews, older young adults who had not yet had a chance to march. But the idea, and there were other iterations made, which I want to speak about in a moment. But there's been a critique developing, which I was going to write myself, but Evelyn Taubman actually put it perfectly in last week's Jewish News. Take a moment and read carefully the pledge of the march, or part of the pledge actually, and what Evelyn Taubman wrote in last week's Jewish News. Now, there's something very important. We could spend 2 hours talking about this. But I want you to take something home with you to think about. There are actually two very, very different visions here of Lo Tishkach, the words said about Amalek, never forget. Remember and never forget. The original pledge commits the Jewish marchers to an all-Jewish agenda. Now I will tell you right away, the pledge has been added to, but the original iteration of the pledge is an all-Jewish pledge. Evelyn Taubman is saying two things, both of great significance, because she's from a different generation. She's saying, I don't know if I'm only supposed to remember the Shoah. I think there's other reasons for change. The Shoah is not the only pillar for change, and change is not only tikkun olam, improving the world, has a wider context. Now, I could spend 2 hours here telling you about Facing History's trip to Poland in June, but suffice it to say that the March of the Living is working on becoming a much more complex narrative, especially now that the museum in Warsaw is up. And the narrative is more complex. But my question to you still is, and ponder it, because I ponder it quite a few nights in a week. When you take 17-year-olds on a 2-week trip, and they are sleep deprived, and they're eating sugar all day, how much the subtlety of the nuances of the vast array of victims, bystanders, and of course, perpetrators will they understand when they go to an area that's just loaded with ethnic conflict. Go read Snyder's book about the Bloodlands. So here we're seeing, but for the purpose of our talk tonight, we're seeing something very, very important. Tobin is challenging the whole idea of worrying about the Holocaust. She's saying the Holocaust is not necessarily the catalyst my generation needs to affect tikkun olam. But I want to take this further. Because our belief that the state of Israel was of necessity a good thing, and that how could one not be a Zionist and not empathize with Zionism? After all, we were persecuted and we won our homeland back. When Yasser Arafat's evilly brilliant speech in the UN started the whole Zionism is racism campaign, which you can draw practically a straight line from there to Israel, into anti-Israel apartheid week. You can practically straight line it. Except the problem also is that some of our kids are so white that they now are feeling that maybe we have joined a class of the victimizers rather than the victims. Now, Jennifer Peto's thesis created a huge stir. I give you the thesis title. Her argument was very simple. And the simplicity of the argument is very, very interesting. So let's compare her argument and Taubman's. Take a moment and try not to get lost in your emotions. Now, I have to tell you an interesting personal story. When I first heard about Peto's thesis, it was in the summer of 2010, just after it went around academic circles. Because nowadays, every thesis gets posted at U of T to the website at Robart's library, and the summary of that thesis is immediately online. So I read this thesis, and everyone's writing, oh my God, how can U of T allow this sort of thing? And pages of, quite frankly, rubbish. I want to explain to you why I call it rubbish. We need to learn how to engage in a debate in an academic manner. People want to say to me, I think Israel's an apartheid state. You can say that to me all you like. I will then take out facts that will refute you. I'm not going to start screaming. I'm not going to start crying. Because I'm comfortable enough in this country, and actually we're privileged enough to be in this country, to be able to argue back on academic grounds. When I heard about Peto's thesis, I looked up the thesis online. She's a part-time student. And her thesis didn't make sense to me, but I looked at her introduction. In her introduction, she wrote the following, I quote almost word for word. I read the literature of the March of the Living and its associated organizations, but I never interviewed any of the participants because as a part-time student, I'm exempt from this kind of research. I took that little excerpt, wrote a letter to the provost of U of T that said the following. I have 3 degrees from U of T. I'd like to come back to your office and give them back to you. Because if this is true, that part-time students have to do only half of the research the full-time students do, and there are different rules for them, then you can take back my degrees because they aren't worth anything. I don't care what she argues. She's a member of the academy like I am, but there's rules to play by. How did you put your imprimatur on this? Part next. A friend of mine, well-placed at U of T, phoned me up a few days later, told me the following story. The entire admin of U of T suddenly appeared at OISE, and they all went to the office of a certain person and said, where do we find the person who was responsible for this thesis? And the person said, I don't know, why are you coming to me? You know who supervised this thesis, deal with him. Why are you all so mad? Suddenly you're so worried about it? Didn't hear a word from you guys for 2 weeks. Oh, says the provost, I got a letter from a guy at U of T. The only letter I got from any Jewish person had nothing to do with how upset they were. The person said to me, I'm going to give back my degrees to U of T because a part-time student gets cut slack. That's absolute rubbish, and I want that degree dealt with. This is how you argue. This is what we do in our country. But let's get back to Peto and Taubman and whiteness. Peto is obviously so comfortable where she is that she thinks we've made it. In fact, we've made it to the role where we're beyond the role of white. We're now out to victimize everyone who ain't where we are. Now, on the one hand, I say revolting and disgusting because of her argumentation. On the other hand, I say sociologically interesting. She's so comfortable that she thinks now that we need to be made uncomfortable because we've lost any empathy. Now, of course, the new anti-Semitism and all of Jewish history and ethics and values put the lie to that. But her extreme position is interesting in the sociological light of whiteness. On the other hand, in a more mainstream way, look at Taubman. Taubman's saying something I think is very important. She's saying, let's go back to where we were in the United States in 1964, when Jews led marches where they fought for blacks to get votes, where Abraham Joshua Heschel and other people led civil rights marches. We Jews abide by the Torah. The Torah says, "V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim." Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and be kind to the other people. That's where Tikkun Olam comes from. Because of our victimhood, we fight victimhood against Jews and beyond. That is a more in-community way of whiteness, but also indicates that the Shoah is receding into the past. Hang on, I'm having trouble advancing our lovely slides. I'll do it by hand. Doesn't want to move. Hang on one second. Notice their issue here. Please be clear. I think Peto's argument is unsubstantiated and ridiculous. And either way, the new anti-Semitism shows she doesn't know what she's talking about. And I told you my personal story to indicate that. That's one way to whiteness. Zionism, the Shoah, and we remember our victimhood and try to help others. The other way has very little to do with Judaism as a religion, and almost everything to do with Judaism as social justice. If you recall what I said before, you remember that the members of the unions, the people like the unionists, the socialists, the communists, didn't believe that Judaism was a religion. They believed it was a way of life, a culture, and for many of them, an ideology that talked about being anti-racist. This very interesting picture is taken from 1945. It shows varsity students picketing the Icelandia ice rink. In 1945, a young black youth named Gary decided to go skating at the Icelandia ice rink, 1961 Young Street. No longer there, it's now a liquor store, far better use for the place. Icelandia was a private rink, and his parents told him, don't go there, they don't like blacks. He went and was told to leave. His friends left with him. He came home and told his parents. His father went to the Toronto Board of Control, where Mayor Saunders was presiding, and said, I'm so sorry to take your time, but I'm upset that my son was thrown out of, I admit, a private institution, but the war is over. Black people fought for the war in Canada. Are we no longer good enough to be citizens and go into an ice rink? Mayor Saunders said that we have nothing better to do with our time than talk about your son's case. This happened again in 46 and 47 to Jewish and Greek kids. In the end, the city passed legislation that made it practically impossible for even private places to discriminate. In 1946 as well, we have the RAND formula, which at one stroke after the war mandated a system for unionization. In one stroke, all the battles of the unions weren't won, but the idea that unions were there to stay was there. As well, Congress was very involved in the immigration of the garment workers and the furriers, many of whom, quite frankly, probably weren't needed here, but the industries bent over backwards to bring in their brethren from Europe. Congress and the Jewish Labor Committee especially had a huge role in the Fair Employment Practices Act in Ontario, and they sent a major brief to the Supreme Court in the striking down of residential covenants in Land of Pines. And of course, later on that decade, we had the first Jewish mayor of Toronto, which is Right. So in the 50s, we see the other Jewish whitening agenda, social justice. These aren't the people who go to shul. These aren't the people who necessarily always worry about Judaism and religion. But they believe Judaism is social justice. And they do a huge amount, not only to bring Jews, but all other ethnic groups who formerly have been on the fringe into the mainstream. And this is a sign that we as a community are maturing, because we are comfortable with moving beyond the borders of Batter Street in a symbolic manner. Our definition of community has widened to encompass the rest of the city. So now let's go back to traditional geography. I know if I left out your Schneebel, it wasn't deliberate. I'm looking at the major synagogues in the movement of suburbanization south of Steeles. And the interesting thing here is that with only two exceptions, Shari Shemayim and Shari Tefillah, all of these shuls are, B'nai Torah, which I'll talk about in a moment, all these shuls are conservative. And the two earliest examples of Orthodox shuls have very low mechitzot, very low separations between men and women. That's no accident either. What's going on here? So on the one hand, and we go back to my teacher Raymond Breton's thesis, that Jews are organizationally complete. As Jews move north, their organizations move with them. A very expensive process, but it also shows that the organizations are healthy and that they have a belief that this move is permanent. But what are the numbers that are driving this? Take a look at these for a moment. The increase between 41 and 51 is almost entirely due to Holocaust survivors. And quite a bit of it between 51 and 56 is also due to Hungarian Jewish refugees. We see a population that's expanding rapidly and moving up Batter Street, and for a while up Bayview as well. And the shuls, as you saw, are moving with them. What this also means, though, is something very interesting. Shuls aren't just moving. All the Jews are on the move. Schools are moving too. But is this a different kind of move than the ones we've been looking at? I suggest to you there's a world of difference. First of all, we see the rise of the day school. It's Chaim and Associated moved north. Associated actually had a day school since 1944, but almost no one used it. Bialik was founded. Eitz Chaim moved up, and for a while was mostly an afternoon school and then began day school. But the two most interesting examples are the foundation school right here of USDS and Beth Tzedec together. I want to tell you that story. Aaron Nussbaum's not here tonight, but he would tell you the same story. And the story is very important because it tells us a great deal about what makes this movement different than the others. When Aaron Nussbaum was brought in to start USDS, the members of Beth Tzedec and the larger conservative movement wanted kids to have what was called a foundational education. They believed that having the kids in school from JK, SK 1, 2, and 3 would give their kids a solid foundation in being Jewish, and then they would all go to afternoon school to complete their educations at their respective synagogues. Now behind this lies what we see in Milton Harris's comment at Associated. Milton Harris isn't white at all yet. He's worried that being too Jewish is somehow going to be un-Canadian. Milton Harris was a major supporter of Associated, but when it came up from Brunswick to Neptune and began to shift to an all-day school format, Milton Harris wrote, what's going on here? Now we're going to have Jewish math, Jewish science, Jewish English. Will there be no end to it? Aaron Nussbaum similarly told me that they were completely convinced that after 5 years, all the parents would say, thank you very much, and now we'll send our kids to public school, because after all, we're Canadian Jews. But we felt so comfortable here that we said, we want to emphasize our Jewishness, and we can keep our kids in a day school and learn a combined curriculum, and that won't make us any less Canadian, but it will ensure that we are still going to be Jewish. A new idea of whiteness, almost like the one that we hear from the government in its attitude to multiculturalism. It's okay to be hyphenated. It wasn't okay to be hyphenated in lecture number 1. It wasn't okay to be hyphenated in lecture number 2. But now, we've made it into suburbia. And Canada's becoming hyphenated. We can be hyphenated too, even before the government officially adopts multiculturalism. There's also another point here. Look at this for a moment, please, so you can absorb what I want to tell you. The mid-50s to the early 80s are the golden age of conservative Judaism in Toronto. The two synagogues that were not conservative of significance, Sharei Shamayim, first iteration on St. Clair, then it's moved to Glencairn in 67, 68, and Sharei Tefillah, which late 50s, which originally was called the Downsview Jewish Community Center, and then changed its name to Sharei Tefillah when it merged with two other smaller shuls to move from downtown I should say. Both of them had very low mechitzot. Why? Because the Orthodox community was worried. Rabbi Shil told me a story that when Israel first moved up to its present location, he went canvassing in the neighborhood, which was just getting built. And every door he knocked on, he said, hi, I'm Erwin Schild, and I'm going to be the rabbi of the shul. First question he got, was everyone asked, was, can our family sit together? And that's why the balcony at Israel was there, and it's only there for overflow. He quickly said, I got the idea that if I had any ideas of keeping a mechitza in the suburbs, they weren't going to go anywhere. And so Rabbi Soloveitchik of Boston was cognizant of this trend. And he said to Sharei Shamayim and Sharei Tefillah, you may build a shul with a lower mechitza, provided you set things up in a certain manner. So that alone will show you the triumphalism of conservatism. Because Will Herberg wrote this incredible book in 1960 called Protestant Catholic Jew. You might remember that Leave It to Beaver is a perfect family. You know, 2 kids, the car in the driveway, Dad comes home, hi June, where's my drink? Let's have dinner. And on Saturday, everyone goes to shul. Or if you're not Jewish, on Sunday you go to church, and that's suburbia. And that, for a while, is how things worked. And that's why we have buildings like this one, which is based on Mordechai Kaplan's idea of the synagogue center, also known now by its iteration as Cineplex, because it's something here for everyone. Conservative Judaism was triumphant. Things are great on Bathurst Street. But you know, our history ain't easy to learn because there's always a speed bump in the road. Here's a speed bump. Take a look for a moment, please. Very famous, well-known conservative rabbi, who will not give me permission to quote his name, told me the following. If I had known now what I know about Orthodoxy, the biggest surprise I ever got in my life was that Orthodoxy is still here. I don't know if I would have become a conservative rabbi. All of a sudden, from nowhere, comes along this Art Scroll Siddur. First edition, maybe 79, the real hardboiled edition, 80, 81. It's a very interesting siddur. You may remember the siddurim of your grandparents, or maybe you still have one. Besides the fact that that thing looks beat up, and it has 5 different sizes of Hebrew font, and there isn't a single instruction in English in the whole darn thing, except for the numbers of pages which you can read. That siddur is designed for the person who knows how to pray. And the people who knew how to pray were always the so-called Orthodox, who actually reveled in the fact that conservative Jews and Reform Jews somehow needed directions in their pages. Now, whether that's right or wrong, along comes Art Scroll. Art Scroll, first of all, is a gorgeously designed piece of work. One of the earlier examples of computer typesetting we see. The translation is very militant. Marty Luxon's given a lot of interesting lectures on when you want to take an extreme translation, Art Scroll takes it. The commentary, though, is fascinating. The commentary is designed for people who are, you probably all heard this word by now, but 1981, we didn't hear it, Balei Tshuva. Think of the word Balei Tshuva. A Balei Tshuva is a person who's a master of repentance. The Gemara uses that term to describe someone who, from one Yom Kippur to the next, has done an exemplary job of repentance. But you and I know that that term has been politicized. That term now means the person who found the right way with a capital R-I-G-H-T. And often they claim that they were seeking authenticity and moving away. I remember the mitzvah mobile outside Mackenzie catching fish all through the 70s for Chabad. But here we have the Art Scroll Siddur. And at the same time, Tannenbaum, who owned the land for a good 10 years before, says now is the time's right. The Jewish neighborhoods are filled up to Steeles. I own 200 acres north of Steeles. Time to build this neighborhood called Spring Farm. By the way, there's neither a farm nor a spring there. But he called it Spring Farm. Maybe after spring chicken, I don't know. But he produced, you can call it, if you're a detractor, a suburban ghetto. An all-Jewish plaza. Some people tell me, some of my Israeli colleagues tell me, the only time they think there is Israel is when they're up in the plaza on Clark. Other people tell me I feel very Jewish in that plaza. Other people tell me it's a great idea to go there and buy matzah. I'll tell you though, the Sobeys does more business than there are Sobeys in Canada in the month of Pesach. That's a fact. At any rate, what we see is suburban orthodoxy. And suburban orthodoxy ain't the kind of people who were Haredim 40 years ago. Suburban orthodoxy is educated, slick, cool, and convinced that it is the future. All of this is happening suddenly as Toronto Jewry moves north of Steeles, but there's more changes on the way. Look at what's driving it. Now, a huge number of these, by the way, are refugees from where? Montreal. We start to see in 81 the shift from Montreal to Toronto becomes very pronounced. As people flee after Levesque, people come. You know the old joke? The answer to Bill 91 was 401. People ran here. We also have a huge influx of Israelis and Russians. So the community is again, as it was in the 20s, diversifying. And many of the community, in fact most now, live north of Steeles. What that means is that once again, all these community organizations, which are now unified under UJA, have to make hard decisions. UJA is collecting more money. But how are you going to allocate that money now? So many more needs, so many more people want it, so many more institutions to create and sustain, and the length of Jewish communality on Bathurst now stretches further than ever before. From St. Clair to Thornhill Woods, or arguably as people go further south, back down to Spadina and Bloor, all the way up. Here's what's going on in short. Some fascinating things. Let's look at the counter trends first. I have a friend of mine who said to me, you know, Jack, I was sitting outside the Starbucks on Spadina Road having a lovely coffee, and all of a sudden all these black hatters came by me on Shabbos, and I thought I was in your neighborhood. And there's something to be said for that. We're seeing some fantastically interesting demographic shifts in Toronto. Modern Orthodoxy is moving to the right. Many of its proponents who used to be poor are now not anymore. And part of their triumphalism is Village Shul, the new one on St. Clair and Spadina. We have arrived. The other thing is the movement back downtown. My friend Dan Goldberg, who's now principal at Paul Penna, tells me the population downtown is actually increasing, and that's what studies tell us too. That's great. We feel so comfortable now in the city, we can move all around it. Though Bathurst Street, interestingly, is still the axis. So in a way, if we go back to the original lecture, which I know you all remember, we start with Abraham migrating from Ur to Toronto, or Ur to Eretz Israel. It's now almost like Abraham gets a ticket and says, you know what, Abraham, things are so nice in Ur, you can come back for a visit. It's almost like my mother, 50 years after the Shoah, was told by the city of Berlin, you know what, it's 1988, and things are okay here now, you can come back for a visit. Same thing now downtown. We have the River. The neighborhood's getting in again. It's getting cool again. It's cool to be Jewish back downtown. We are very white in the sense that we feel comfortable. We have become an accepted group, except for modern anti-Semitism, which thank God hasn't really come here yet. We're very fortunate. Where that's going to take us, we don't know, because none of all of our brethren in Toronto are. That's why number 4 produced so many arguments in the community. Because when we moved north with JTT, the Jewish Toronto tomorrow, with these magnificent edifices, there was a huge debate. Do we really need to spend this money on? Or we have donors who want to spend the money. Or, well, in the States, some people spend money on Jewish education. Or, well, maybe not everyone wants Jewish education. Why are you telling us how to spend our money? These are the conflicts in a community with centralized fundraising that is fortunate enough to have all this money, but we are justified to argue over where to spend it. Let's look for a moment at Thornhill Woods. We were upset about residential covenants. Now we're upset about Muslims living next door. Read the Canadian Jewish News last week for an interesting article. One point of view. We are definitely white. My question to you is that good or bad? My friend Morton Weinfeld again says, adult immigrants never integrate in the community. Well, my friends, most of us and most of the community, except now for the Israelis and the Russians, most of us are born here. And we're integrated. Is that good or bad? Everyone's been squirming about the Pew Report. I'm not going to talk to you about the Pew Report. You probably want to say Pew already and go away from it. You're sick of hearing everyone who walks up to a podium telling you what he or she thinks the Pew Report means. But the Pew Report says one incontrovertible fact. That people feel great about being Jewish, but less and less feel that Judaism is a religion. Now you may say, so Jack, so what? So, a lot of our people believe that Judaism was a way of life. That was tikkun olam. Look what they accomplished. They helped wipe out racial discrimination in Ontario. They helped bring union bargaining rights. They did a lot of good here. They built hospitals. What's your issue? My issue as a sociologist is, let me throw it up there. We have Breton's ethnic completeness in spades. We have all the institutions. We have all the kind of Jews to let you know who they are also. We have every stripe of Jew you ever wanted to know. And some new ones. But what are we going to do? This is approach 1. Let me tell you, this works. Go to Montreal. Go to the Haredi communities. Those guys have the simple approach. I'm taking my chuck wagons. I'm circling the wagons. I'm going to survive, and everyone outside, well, too bad for them. I have to tell you that sociologically, this really works. You and I may not like that, but you have a large birth rate, whereas most other Jews are at 0 population growth or below. You have outing of people who don't conform. And you have actually a great deal of liking for doing the mitzvot. Though if you read some of their publications carefully lately, there's a great deal of unease in their community and concern as well. Or is Jewish continuity the smorgasbord? Just what I tell my students. Each of those things on the table is a type of Judaism. My job, and that of other educators, is to teach it to you, as we've learned it together, very briefly, for the last 3 lectures. There's a hell of a lot of history and continuity out there, but there are no easy answers. A lot of bumps on the road, a lot of curves. We're still on Bathurst Street, but the road's gotten longer between the southern part and the northern part. Some Jews have gotten off Bathurst Street, but they're very Jewish. My concern is that everyone knows how to identify what's on the table, and then you know how the sweets table works. It's open season. Pick what you want. The only clear factor, my final slide, and thank you for your attention, is one thing that all the reports say, though none of them can prove why. The more Jewish education children have, the more likely it is that we'll have Jewish continuity. And the challenge of Jewish education now in the internet age is not simply getting the kids in the room. It's inspiring them despite all the noise of social media. I don't know where we're going to end up with all these challenges. There are so many choices, and you and I had it easier. But I'd like to think that what we see here is possible. And our community is right by giving such a large allocation to Jewish education. And I think as well as we teach our kids about family, exemplify that, and we emphasize religion simply because it's a winning hand in sociology. And we teach kids there's many ways to experience Judaism. And above all, inspire them by being exemplars. There'll still be a long road on Bathurst Street, and our grandchildren will still be on it. So thank you very much.